And I'm back from the BRICS in Kazan in the Muslim Republic of Tatarstan within Russia. I do hope it wasn't a criminal offense. I actually consulted the British government's website today to see if speaking to my Russian chambermaid in my hotel might have constituted a connection with a person connected to Russia, because that is what the British government says. Of course, the BBC and Sky News were there, famously in the case of the latter. They didn't air their interview with me at Kazan, but 5 million people have already seen it because my good wife Gayatri had the quick-wittedness to film the whole thing, knowing it would turn into a classic. The BBC and Sky News were there, and they won't be in any difficulty because they hate Russia, and that is officially approved. There were 36 presidents and prime ministers, princes and kings, and scores of other ministers, 20,000 delegates, 2,000 journalists. More than half the world was at BRICS, even if the Western media tried to ignore it until they could ignore it no longer and began to pour hatred and invective against it. The London Times called it a grotesque summit. The German newspaper Bild called it a summit of scoundrels. Well, if half the world are now defined as scoundrels, that tells you more about the people handing out the definitions. There were some real highlights. Iran became a full member of the BRICS. Turkey became a partner member of the BRICS, as did some of the most unlikely countries. Several British Commonwealth heads of state came to Russia instead of meeting King Charles at the Commonwealth Summit. The tectonic plates are shifting. The world's axis is moving decisively. And that old saw, the sun is rising in the east. And in the south, the global east, how long will it be before the first European Union member attempts to join the BRICS? Let me be the first to predict that European Union member will be Hungary. The Hungarian leader is today in Georgia, where NATO and the EU are seeking to mount a coup d'etat, similar to the one they tried in Ukraine in 2014, and millions are dead as a result. We'll be keeping a watching brief on that subject. Of course, the atrocities, the massacre, the genocide in Gaza continues. The relentless mass murder in Lebanon continues. But Israel has now lost more than 800 dead soldiers in the fight in the north of Palestine, in the south of Lebanon. And they've lost more than 11,000 wounded. As a ratio of wounded to dead, that is a suspiciously high number. It's normally 3 wounded to 1 dead. Israel claims it's 11 or 12 or 13 wounded to 1 dead. That might tell you something about Israeli armored protection for their forces, or it might mean that they are lying about the number of dead soldiers. But it is now a big issue in Netanyahu's apartheid colonial state as to whether they can afford to continue the war that they themselves launched against Lebanon. And hey, just as Iran was getting ready to even the score at 3 strikes for 3 strikes, Israel has decided it's going to attack Iran again, this time for the offense of breaking Netanyahu's bedroom window when he wasn't even home. They are determined to cause all-out war, and the West is doing absolutely nothing to stop them. We're going to discuss it all here. You've come to the right place. This is Have It Out with Galloway. Professor Dan Kovalik is a good friend of mine. He is a lawyer. He is an author of great note. I myself have two of his books on my shelves. He's a political analyst almost beyond compare. Certainly in the United States, where proper political analysis is thin on the ground. So we are lucky to have Dan Kovalik with us on Have It Out with Galloway. Dan, good to see you. Exciting few days in the United States. Before I ask you about the BRICS, what's your current estimation as to what's going to happen on the 5th of November in the United States?
Yes, well, first, thanks for having me, George. It's always my pleasure, my honor. If I were a betting person, and I'm not, I would bet on Donald Trump. I think Trump is going to win. Kamala, once she announced she was going to be the presidential candidate after the soft coup against Biden, her numbers were very high, and she was winning and winning. And that's changed in recent weeks. The trend now is towards Trump in a big way, and that's because she's done a series of interviews where she doesn't answer questions, she can't define herself or won't define herself, and the trend seems to be towards Trump. That's what I'm seeing.
Well, we'll see soon enough. You heard me say in my introduction, I've just been at the BRICS. To me, it felt like the future being born. How did it look to you?
Yes, well, I agree with you, George. I mean, what you're seeing is something pretty incredible. Just to give one example, think about the countries that are in BRICS. Think about the fact that China and India, who've been mortal enemies, that have an ancient border dispute, apparently now are going to settle that dispute, because of their relationship in the BRICS. You have Vietnam joining, who also has been a mortal enemy of China. BRICS is the future. In fact, I think BRICS may be the future of international diplomacy, as the UN is in its twilight, frankly, because the West, and in particular the United States, has done everything it can to destroy international law, the international law system created after 1945 and embodied in the United Nations. I think BRICS will be the future of international diplomacy and law.
Well, I'm with you on that, though certainly the Russians, and I think also the Chinese, are loath to encourage speculation that the BRICS is a United Nations in waiting. But my view about the UN now could not be more jaundiced. The UN has proved to be absolutely powerless in a very humiliating way. Their Secretary General is declared persona non grata by Israel. Their personnel are murdered by Israel. Israel has just banned the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which has the power of international law behind it, and the UN is literally incapable of doing anything about it. So much as many people, especially older people, revere the United Nations, love its foundational principles and so on, if a piece of equipment no longer works, Dan, in your house, you throw it out, you get a new one if the old one can't be fixed. And I think the UN can no longer be fixed.
I agree with you. And I've taught international human rights law for 12 years, George. I can no longer teach it with a straight face. What's there to teach about? I mean, it now can only be taught of as a history class, right? As a historic relic. And again, we have to emphasize it doesn't work on purpose. The United States in particular has made sure it doesn't work and will never work again. And of course, they've done it largely to protect colonialism and in particular to protect Israel. And I think when you're seeing what's happening in Gaza, as you say, the murder of UN staff people, in Lebanon, Israel's firing upon UN peacekeepers, both the US and Israel have gone out of their way to say, hey, we can do this. We can destroy UN institutions, UN schools, and no one will do a thing about it. And that is a disgrace, George.
Yeah, and it's crying out for somebody to do something. Now, as you rightly said, it would appear that India and China resolved an ancient border dispute that's caused 3 wars between them and innumerable scuffles. They did that around a table in Kazan at the BRICS. Now, if 36 heads of state government can come together outside of the United Nations and resolve problems between them, as you can say Iran and Saudi Arabia did under Russian and Chinese mediation in recent months, then, you know, if the UN can't do it, then somebody else is going to do it, because, you know, you can't have a vacuum in international affairs. But the truth is, Dan, they are all insisting that this is economic, principally. It's a means of getting out from under the US's incessant sanctioning of countries, sabotaging of countries through their control of the reserve currency, through their control of the payments mechanism, the SWIFT system, and so on. How did BRICS in Kazan do on those matters, do you think?
Well, judging by the world response, pretty great. What I saw was that I think something like over 150 countries out of a total of 190 plus countries in the world plan on applying to be part of that new economic system. And for the reasons you're saying, we've talked about before, the US now has about 1/3 of the world's population under sanctions. And that means immiseration for people. It means starvation. It means economic destruction. You know, you look at Cuba, I believe Cuba is now going to become a BRICS partner. Cuba's been destroyed by sanctions. You know, all the accounts that I've heard about where Cuba's at right now, it's in a worse state than it was during the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that's due to US sanctions. And so the world is hungry for this alternative system. And again, the proof's in the pudding that you have the vast majority of the world's nations now applying to be a part of this.
Now, you mentioned the Americas, which was the site of one of the few disappointments, more than disappointments. The Brazilian government and its head of state, Lula, who couldn't be there, but nonetheless put the black spot on both Venezuela and Nicaragua. He effectively vetoed their joining BRICS. This caused quite a bit of anxiety, consternation. President Putin made it clear he didn't agree with Brazil on this, but BRICS membership is done on the basis of a consensual decision-making. What was your take on Lula's apparently strange decision?
Well, obviously, very disappointed. I'm a big supporter of both Venezuela and Nicaragua. Both countries are being subjected to U.S. sanctions. Venezuela, in a very big way. You know, the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR, you know, several years ago did a study that in a one-year period, the U.S. sanctions killed 40,000 people in Venezuela, was their estimate. And, you know, and that was several years ago. So, you know, certainly hundreds of thousands of people died in Venezuela in total due to U.S. sanctions. They need the BRICS. And I think that this shows that Lula, unfortunately, you know, after his arrest and his being sidelined in the 2018 elections, I think he is not the same Lula that we saw before. And he is treading lightly and trying to please the Western masters. And that is quite disappointing. By the way, I happen to know I was in Venezuela about a month ago, and I was talking to some high-ranking Venezuelan officials. I happen to know they thought it was a done deal. They were going to be admitted to BRICS. In fact, they put down the required $500 million deposit that BRICS requires to be part of that institution.
I think we all thought it was a done deal, including the hosts. But Lula, who wasn't able to come, he's quite an elderly man now in any case. He had an accident in his bathroom, sustained a head wound, couldn't travel, but the decisions that he sent were one of the few disappointments, let's put it that way, about BRICS in Kazan. But finally, Dan, Iran, now a fully functioning, full member of BRICS. A tremendous breakthrough. Iran has survived 40 years, more than 40 years of ostracism, sanctions, marginalization, military attacks. And now Iran is one of the top most significant countries in the world. That's something to celebrate from Kazan, isn't it?
Absolutely. Iran is the country really standing between Gaza and complete destruction. They are the linchpin of the resistance. They have to be given a lot of credit for that. They've done, by the way, tons for Venezuela. I think more than any other country in the world to help Venezuela, get through these sanctions. I'm happy for Iran, and I'm also happy for the world. I think they're going to need a lot of support as this war continues in West Asia.
Professor Dan Kovalik, as always, a tour of the horizon that we didn't even have to pay for. Professor Dan, brilliant as always. Now, the first member of the audience to ask a question today is, for obvious reasons, pre-recorded. It's Hala in Gaza. Her question is about whether or not they'll ever be able to return back to Gaza and rebuild their lives. Hala, welcome.
Hello, I'm Hannah. I'm 26 years old. I lost my child, and he died at the age of 6 months. He had a hereditary disease and contracted other disease. An infection killed him. We were not able to travel abroad to treat him. I want to ask a question. Is there hope that we will remain in Gaza on our land, or will we die, or will we escape? And is there hope that we will return and build life again and we get our lives back? Thank you.
Well, I wish I could give a more definite answer. Obviously, only God knows what the final outcome of all this will be. But I'm absolutely sure that the Palestinian people will survive. Their cause will survive. They are as close as humans can be, an indestructible people. They have embarked long ago on the mission never to be extinguished as their colonizer would love them to be. And they, as long as two Palestinians remain alive, there will be a Palestinian resistance. I've been with it for 50 years, half a century, and my children are as enthusiastic behind the cause as me. And that's true around Western countries, as well as almost universal in the global South and in the East. So you have the prayers, you have the good wishes, you have the solidarity of people all over the world. Your resistance is steadfast and true, and it will never give up. So will you ever return to a normal life in Gaza? I can't promise that, or even say unequivocally that the answer is yes. But I'm a believer, and I believe that Palestine will be free. Let's go to Christine Hart, a Sunday Times best-selling author and a former Fleet Street journalist from London. Just my kind of person. Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Hi, George. Lovely to be with you. How are you?
By the grace of God, good.
Good. I wanted to talk about God and where we are with God and how we're all feeling about the existence of God, having seen children be butchered, mass butchered in Gaza, and how we all have to tolerate seeing this, and whether it's around your personal belief in God and the people that sons and daughters have been murdered, about whether it's affected their belief and what people think about, since COVID has occurred. It's almost like we've had some kind of takeover by something dark in the form of the Tom Cruise film Oblivion. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's also the Netflix movies Colony. It just feels as if something really dark and non-human has taken over, and none of us are talking about it or facing it.
Well, that's a very profound and powerful question, and I thank you for it. I haven't seen the film. I avoid films with Tom Cruise in them. But I immediately got the point that you were making. As to those who are losing their sons and daughters, has it shaken their faith in God? Evidently not. I can think of no more faithful, religiously believing set of people on the planet than the people in Gaza. They say it as they emerge from the destroyed houses, as they carry their broken children, dead children, beheaded children. They say into the cameras that God is sufficient for them, that they are deeply appreciative to God for their life, and the apparent faithfulness of the other parts of the Muslim world are also now being tested. And don't even begin to ask me about the faithfulness of the Christian world, because I see people who, make declarations like Christ is King and so on. I saw some Zionists on Twitter this very morning, very prominent people. They're greeting each other now with Christ as King. Which part of Christ's message do they think is exemplified in the conduct of Benjamin Netanyahu? Which part of Jesus's mission in the world, which part of the gospel justifies the wholesale massacre of hundreds of thousands of women and children? Yet these people who declare themselves to be Christians are the same people openly supporting the massacre of God's children in the Gaza Strip in Lebanon. So everyone is being tested, I think, is the point, Christine. We are all being tested by God as to what we did, what we said, what we did not do, what we did not say during the time that men, not God, were butchering the people in Palestine and in Lebanon. Some of us will be able to say that with all the breath that God gave us, we cried out against it. Some will be able to say they raised their hands against it. Some will only be able to say that they cursed it in their heart. But those who went along with it, those who facilitated it, those who denied it, even though it was clear in front of their eyes, live on their telephone, I fear for their prospects on the judgment day. As for me, nothing will ever shake my faith in God, because as I look around the world, as I look at the universe increasingly, as I look at the universes increasingly, as I learn and search more, I believe that the God of the worlds cannot possibly have been simply a random accident. These universes, these hundreds of billions of planets cannot have come about by accident. Nothing comes from nothing. Everything has to be created. And my belief in the Creator is unshaken. Let's go to Exmouth, still in the UK, where Jenna Quayle has a question. Jenna, please, what's on your mind?
Hi, George. I'm actually near Liverpool, not in Exmouth.
Oh, I don't know how we made that mistake. It's a very different place.
Very different accents as well. So my question really is to do with the dual nationals. Obviously, the BBC Online say that there's approximately 44,000 British citizens living in Israel, both full and part-time. Obviously, most notably is David Mensa. The CNN report about the American soldier has highlighted that dual nationals are going over to Israel to carry out war crimes and then are free to escape to their other country that's on their passport and not, not receive any sort of criminal charges for it, really, because they are war criminals. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the families aren't allowed to leave. They're having to be smuggled out, which they need to raise money for. Palestinian families have been blocked from making GoFundMe, so they're having to rely on people around the world to make them for them, which has resulted in, unfortunately, quite a few different families have been had their money taken from them by scammers. So my question is how can we stop any British citizens that are pro-Zionist, part of the Zionist regime, from coming back to Britain? Because frankly, they shouldn't be allowed back.
It's such a brilliant question, Jenna. It scarcely requires an answer, because you have summed up the monstrosity of double standards that exists in this regard. Let's just run through one or two aspects that you didn't cover. There are Palestinian citizens of the United Kingdom whose families are under starvation and hell on earth in Gaza, to whom the British government will not give a visa so that these families can be reunited. The reason that these family members would have to apply in Cairo, but they can't get to Cairo because they're under siege in Gaza. So the British state is telling its UK citizens of Palestinian origin, their mothers, their daughters have to die in Gaza, whilst Israeli UK dual national citizens can go and kill them in Gaza and come back to Britain without so much as a by your leave, without so much as a question by the border force, never mind any sanction or punishment. Now, I give just one other aspect. If I had gone to Russia last week and conducted a television program that breached the British government's sanctions, I would have been arrested at the airport last night when I arrived back. So somebody making a television show in Russia, a British citizen, can be arrested on return to the UK, but an Israeli UK dual national can go and kill people, blow up their houses, behead children, create the world's largest ever cohort of amputees in all human history and walk back into Britain and sit down at their desk at their British employ. Now, you ask me, how can we change that? We can't. We had a chance to on the 4th of July. We had a chance to elect a government that would have made these things different, but we didn't take it, I'm sorry to say. Jenna, thanks for your brilliant question. In Liverpool, not in Exmouth, but Walter Cairns is definitely in Blackpool, and he is most welcome. Walter, what would you like to ask?
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to say this is one practicing Christian who is completely and entirely with the people of Gaza. Right. A question about Gaza. Now, I have a question about October the 7th, because there have been sustained bombing campaigns before by Israel in Gaza. In 2008, there were 21 consecutive days of bombing. In 2014, another campaign costing more than 2,500 Palestinian lives. Now, this time, of course, this is a bombing raid that's gone on for more than a year. So I think they needed some kind of justification for that. And that's why I have massive questions over the authenticity of the official version of what happened on October the 7th. Because are we to believe, George, that a gaggle of heavily armed paragliders can just waltz across the Gazan border, the most closely guarded border in the world, whilst others have to breach through two walls to reach the other side, then take 250 people hostage, and then cart them back across the Gaza border without being stopped? So, George, I think your opponent in Rochdale, Mr. Ali, who is an honourable man, was right. They let it happen, and that's the most charitable explanation. There's another less charitable explanation, which I'll leave you to guess at.
Well, of course, that all may be true, or some of it may be true. We simply don't know that yet. The circumstantial evidence that you adduce is strong, that it's highly likely that the Israeli security forces knew that something was coming on the 7th of October at the very least. There are many people in Israel who agree with my former opponent, who never struck me as all that honourable, but each to their own opinion, who think that. There are many people in Israel who believe that it was a kind of false flag. My problem with that is that it denies the agency of the Palestinians themselves, like they had no justification for a prison break, that they are not capable of effectively resisting Israeli occupation. I simply don't know which alternative is the correct one. History will show us, more evidence will emerge, the truth will out, but it's slow. We still don't know the whole story of what happened on 9/11. The arguments you just made about October 7th could equally strongly be made about 9/11. The Americans used what happened on 9/11 to rampage around the world, killing millions of people. It could be argued that they might not have had the political support to do that if not for the terrorist atrocity that 9/11 represented. So I can't answer you. I have no inside knowledge of it. What I do know is that it is remarkable that there's not an October 7th type uprising all the time in Gaza. Anyone who has seen Gaza, as I did when leading siege-breaking convoys in there in 2008 and 2009, anyone who's smelt the situation of 2.5 million people in a concentration camp would marvel only that so many years passed without an October 7th taking place. You know, the concentration camp victim has a choice. It's a choice to die of starvation, of ill health, of bad water, and little food, and in despair, on their knees in the concentration camp, or try and break out of the concentration camp. There will be many, as there were in the Warsaw Ghetto, who will choose the former, but there will always be some who choose the latter. And that's what I think probably happened on October 7th. But thanks for the call, Walter, as always. Mohammed Amin is a former chairman of the Conservative Muslim Forum, and now a grassroots Liberal Democrat in Manchester. That's quite a transformation from a conservative Muslim to a Liberal Democrat. But welcome to the show nonetheless.
Good afternoon, Mr. Galloway.
And to you, sir.
The format of this program wasn't sort of fully explained to me. I was under the assumption that, like most television programs, you would have something to talk about and questions to ask. But it seems to be that you want us to ask you questions. And one has occurred to me while I've been listening to the earlier part of the program. You talk a lot about God, but which religious group do you actually belong to? Because it's not clear to me.
I'm not entirely sure why that would be your business. I believe in God. What I'd like to ask you is, what first attracted you to the Liberal Democrats? Was it their policy on the LGBTQ plus agenda? Was it their policy on legalizing drugs and pornography? Was it their policies on the reduction of the age of consent? Which particular parts of liberalism appealed to you, Mr. Former Conservative Muslim?
Well, first of all, let's be precise about the conservative Muslim, because sometimes that is misunderstood. It was the Muslim group inside the British Conservative Party. It's not a theological position. So I left the Conservative Party because it chose to have as its leader somebody I regarded as morally unfit to be party leader or prime minister, Mr. Boris Johnson. And I expected him to fail as party leader, which he did, although I got the timescale wrong. I thought he would last about 6 months. He actually lasted 6 times as long. He lasted 3 years. When the general election came along, I don't believe in sitting on the sidelines, so you go through the political parties to decide which of those fits closest with your own views. The Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn was extremely left, and there's no way that I could have supported Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. The Conservative Party had somebody I regarded as morally unfit as its leader, Mr. Johnson, and in England, that leaves the Liberal Democrats as the obvious party to join. I agree with most Liberal Democrat principles and its economic policy. And coming back to what you said earlier, I have no problem. I think we should legalize marijuana, as many other countries have done.
And what about the LGBTQ plus agenda? Are you hot on that too?
I believe that people have and are entitled to full equal civil rights, regardless of whether they are straight or gay.
But that's not the LGBTQ plus agenda, as you very well know. Can a man become a woman by announcing that he is now a woman, as the Liberal Democrats believe?
Well, people get very confused when they talk about transgender issues, in particular because they fail to distinguish carefully enough between sex and gender. Yeah. Now, let me explain my views. Sex, first of all, is a biological property. It's totally binary. You either have 2 X chromosomes or you have an X and a Y chromosome. Apart from a tiny number of very unfortunate people who have more than 2 chromosomes, which is often associated with serious ill health, it's a tiny fraction of the population. And for the purposes of discussion, I would like to leave them to one side.
Yes,
so
we
everybody
all would.
else
We
in the
all would.
population,
And one of your problems is you're rather prolix, and this is a short program. So I suppose I'm grateful to you for coming on the show. I've never heard of you before or seen you before, but we've listened to you for quite a long time, probably long enough. But you may not be a conservative Muslim, but you are a Muslim, and you're comfortable with the LGBTQ++ agenda, and you're comfortable with the legalization of drugs. So I'd say you and the Liberal Democrats are made for each other. I hope you both enjoy it. Cedar Bushu is in Seattle in the US. He is a former service member and an independent journalist who writes for the Seattle Worker in the US. What's your point, my dear friend in Seattle?
The question that I have for you today is about the election coming up in America on we seem to have a growing fascist movement in the country, and I am wondering if revolution is the only way to fix what's wrong with the country.
Well, I mean, the people will make a decision in the United States on the 5th of November as to who will represent them at congressional level and in the White House. I have a candidate that I've been behind, not just from the beginning of this campaign, but from 2016. Dr. Jill Stein, the only Jewish candidate in the race, and the only candidate in the race who opposes the mass murder of Palestinian children in Gaza. I'm with Jill. I hope that she does well. I hope that she begins and creates a tipping point where a third party is possible in the United States, given the ugliness of both cheeks of the US political ass. Calling for a revolution is easy. You just called for one. I could call for one. Making a revolution is very difficult. And I see no signs at all that either your country or mine is remotely likely to be in a revolutionary situation, as people on the left used to call it, anytime soon. But you never know what will happen when people's faith in the fake political process that we have is finally realized. When the British and American workers realize that they've been lied to for a century by both parties, by all three parties, by all of the political class, when they realize that the mass media, which underpins that fake democratic system, is a part of the lie machine, well, they're likely to get very angry indeed. I speak as someone who abhors violence. I don't just abhor it, I oppose it. I oppose political violence of any kind. I believe in building a mass movement for change in your country and in mine. In my experience, building that mass movement does not become easier by calling for revolution, but rather becomes more difficult. Charles Stanyan is in Mexico, and let's see what he has to say about voting for Dr. Jill Stein. Go ahead, Charles.
Hello, George, and welcome back from the BRICS conference. Well done. Well done. Thank you. I'm getting a lot of pushback from friends and family regarding voting for Jill Stein. I mean, I'm 80 years old. I've never seen anything like this in an election in my life. People are really freaking out. And I'm talking about my niece and nephew and, people really close to me. And they're just freaking out. Like, like if Trump gets in, it's the end of the world. America's going down the tube. We'll all be prisoners of his fascist regime. And I mean, it just borders on insanity. But anyway, my question is, and I remind people that voting for either of those other two candidates is paramount to voting for genocide. And that there can be there's no gray area there. So anyway, what I want to ask you is
absolutely correct, Charles. A vote for the Harris administration, Biden-Harris, is a vote that will stain your hands with blood forevermore. You can say that Trump will be even worse. Well, what's he going to do? As Jimmy Dore said the other night on Tucker Carlson, is he going to dig the babies up and murder them all over again? He might or he might not be worse. We can't know that. But we already know who is doing the murdering right now. And that is the government of Biden-Harris. So that pushback from your family, I'd push right back at that pushback if I were you. They're clearly suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. I despise Trump. I despise many of the things he did when he was in power last time, 2016 to 2020. I could never vote for him. But those who use Trump's idiosyncrasies, foolishness, vulgarity, and crimes as a reason to persuade you to vote instead for Kamala Harris, well, frankly, I have no time for them. Andrew Thompson has a question for me, I think. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks, George. Yeah, so I want to ask a question about Hezbollah and the Syrian situation. I was reading some analysis the other day that strategic Libya alliance between Syria and Hezbollah was actually really damaging to Said Nasrallah, played a part in his assassination. I just wanted to ask if you think that it was a mistake to align so closely with the Syrian regime. I mean, from any perspective, really, but just from the perspective of how it, caused a bit of friction with Hamas, how apparently, the kind of channels of communication were opened up, made it easier to track. Your thoughts, just generally, whether you think that may have been a negative factor.
Well, I honestly don't understand where you're coming from. Would it have been better to allow ISIS and Al-Qaeda to triumph in Syria? Certainly that's what the British government did. Certainly that's what the American government did. But if I had to pick between President Assad and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, that's a kind of no-brainer. And I would have thought a cool young man like you would have found that a very easy choice to make. And that's the choice that Nasrallah evidently made for his own reasons. It's the choice that the mass of the Syrian people made. The mass of the Syrian armed forces are Sunni Muslims, and they fought and in many cases died fighting the pernicious bloodlust murder cult of ISIS, Al-Qaeda. I would have thought all right-thinking people were against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, whatever they thought of Bashar al-Assad. Oftentimes in life, you have to choose between two people, neither of whom are your cup of tea, but one of them is a very, very large cup of blood. That one was ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That's why I supported the Syrian Arab Republic. I'm proud to have done so. You make it seem like I should be ashamed of having done so. I stood with the Syrian Arab Republic, and I would have been proud to do so, even if it had lost. I'm even more proud of the fact that it prevailed and that ISIS and Al-Qaeda were defeated in Syria by the Syrian people, their armed forces, and of course, their allies. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, come back next week at the same time, same place, to have it out with Galloway.